Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar all about FARMAX 8. My name's Tom Boddicker. I'm a business development manager here at FARMAX, and I'm going to be taking you through today's webinar. So there are a few things that we've got planned for today. Firstly, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking through some of the background and sort of the reasons why FARMAX 8 was developed and why some of the new features that you'll see are there. But the vast majority of today is going to be a demo of some of the new features and new reports that are in FARMAX 8 Dairy. So as always with these webinars, feel free to ask questions throughout. I will answer all of the questions probably towards the end. And we'll do our best to answer questions right off the bat, but if there's anything that we can't answer straight away, we'll be sure to follow up with you probably in an email. And just to note that this webinar is being recorded, so we'll also be sending out a link to the replay within the next day or two so that you can watch it back if you would like to as well. So let's get straight into some of the background with FARMAX 8. So essentially with a few things in mind, we sort of went down a slightly new track for FARMAX. FARMAX has quite a long history at this point in terms of modeling farm systems with a particular focus on really production and profitability. But more and more we're having to, or at least farmers are having to focus on also the environmental sustainability of their businesses. So that was really the core driver of some of the newer things that you'll see today in FARMAX 8. We see farming as sort of a three-legged stool of production, environment, and profitability. And if sort of any of the one legs on that three-legged stool are not in check, the whole business sort of falls over. So that's really the key driver behind why we made some of the changes that we've done. Production and profitability are still going to be massive components of FARMAX, but we at least wanted to add in some environmental indicators because we are getting more and more requests for that from yourselves, from the users of FARMAX. And we see it as important for agriculture in New Zealand moving forward. So in terms of the plan today and some of the new features that we're going to go through, so I've already mentioned a little bit that we have some greenhouse gas or that we have some environmental reporting in FARMAX 8. So we're going to cover the two main parts of that, which are going to be greenhouse gas reporting and also a nitrogen balance, which are both new features of FARMAX. And then we also have quite a number of updates and enhancements to some of the existing features or some of the existing sort of areas that FARMAX was already covering. So one of the major ones is auto milk calibration. If you've ever done sort of monthly updates to a FARMAX Dairy file, you'll be quite familiar with some of the calibration methodology that you would have had to go through in the past. So we've made that much simpler and automated now. We're also going to go through some updates to genetic merit that we've made in terms of some of the background science and behind FARMAX. And we also have a few enhancements to the performance screen that we will share with you today as well. So let's get straight into it. I will open up FARMAX. And I will also open up a FARMAX file. Great. So first thing we're going to have a look at is some of the newer greenhouse gas reporting in FARMAX. Again, feel free to ask as many questions as you like along the way as I go through this. Essentially, we have a new greenhouse gas report at a few different levels of FARMAX. So currently I'm clicked on the top level, this FARMAX 8 webinar level. So this is usually the area in FARMAX where you find most of your whole farm reports. So we've got your profit and loss and gross margins, physical summary, sort of whole farm pasture growth reporting, all that sort of stuff. And we've added greenhouse gas reports into that mix. So if I go to the greenhouse gas report here for this farm, and I'll just make this a little bit larger for everyone. So hopefully you can see that. So we have a brand new report in FARMAX all about greenhouse gases. Now, everything here is reported in CO2 equivalents. So in the background of FARMAX, we're calculating a few different components that arrive at a CO2 equivalence number, and you'll see the breakdown of that in this front screen of this report. So we've got, for this particular farm, a little over 9 tonne per hectare of CO2 equivalents coming from methane. We've got some coming from nitrous oxide and some coming from urea hydrolysis. And one of the cool things that FARMAX is able to do, where because we cover a lot of different aspects of a farm system, we're able to also combine that with some sort of efficiency metrics. So you'll see, you will have seen this in the sheep and beef version of FARMAX 8 if you managed to catch that webinar as well. And essentially, we've been able to combine some of these greenhouse gas outputs with some of the profitability and production figures from the farm. So for this particular property, we've got 1.8 kilos of CO2 equivalents per dollar of gross margin. So you can get a feel for your emissions for every dollar of gross margin generated on the property, and how well you're doing on that particular KPI. And in terms of stacking that up against production, we've also got, in this case, 8.9 kilos of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk solid produced. So you're able to see some of these efficiency metrics and able to watch them change sort of during running various scenarios in FARMAX. And one of the things I should mention here, because I'm sure it's something in all of your minds, and something that was asked in a previous webinar. Essentially, one of the fundamental reasons behind adding in these greenhouse gas reports is to give farmers and rural professionals an indication of greenhouse gases. We didn't create this with the intention of replacing existing tools. We simply wanted to add this as a new component to the farm. So what that allows you to do basically is run some various scenarios on a farm system, which you might put in place to mitigate various environmental outputs, and basically get an indication of which direction that is going to push your overall emissions. So if you import more supplements, or if you milk more cows or anything like that, you're probably going to see an increase in the greenhouse gas emissions here. And you are likely to see a similar increase in other environmental tools as well. So it's really an indication to see kind of which direction you're moving with various changes. But that's what we've got for the greenhouse gas report. So this report is available at a couple of different levels. We've also got it for the dairy enterprise, which in this case is the only enterprise on the farm, and that's going to be pretty common for most of the dairy farms you set up. But if you have, for example, a split calving farm where you've got a spring dairy enterprise and a autumn cows enterprise, you can get different reports for each of those different kind of stock classes. We also have greenhouse gas reporting for individual mobs. So again, the cows are going to make up the vast majority of this. But we also have that for something like our heifer calves. So for this particular farm, we have our heifer calves actually on the property up until about December. So we've got some greenhouse gas emissions, obviously a lot less than the cows because they're a much smaller component of the overall system. But we have some greenhouse gas numbers coming in for the calves until they leave the farm in December in this case. So that is where the greenhouse gas report is available and some of the things that it's doing. You may notice that some of the efficiency metrics are only available at certain levels. So our financial metrics, our kilos of CO2 per dollar of gross margin is only available at the enterprise and the farm level. We don't have that for individual mobs. And the kilos of product is only obviously available for mobs that produce milk. So we're not seeing that for our heifer calves here. So that is our greenhouse gas reporting. Any questions on that, definitely fire them through and answer them as best I can. But for now, we'll keep moving on. So the other new environmental report we've added is something called Imbalance. Now this is a report that's following essentially some of the logic of Dairy NZ and their the work they've done on nitrogen balance. And it's effectively, again, trying to give you an indication of which direction the farm might move with various changes you could make in a farm system. So again, I'll use the example of imported feed. If you reduced the level of imported feed coming into the property, you would also see a reduction in your imbalance because there's less purchased feed kind of coming into the system. So it's intended, again, to give you an overall sort of indication of which direction the farm is moving with your various changes. And the things that basically make up this imbalance we've got in here in this table on the left-hand side. So nitrogen fertilizer is obviously a large component. We have stock coming in and stock going out. We've got purchased feed, and there's obviously in a dairy situation, a lot of nitrogen leaving the farm through milk production. So we're looking at the protein leaving the farm from milk production. And from all of that, we're giving you an overall imbalance figure. So that is our new imbalance report. So again, feel free to fire through any questions you might have on that. So those are some of the new environmental reports we have. One of the other things we've added, which isn't necessarily a new report, but it's along the same lines with incorporating some of the other components of farm systems that are kind of happening in this area, is we've also actually recently added the ability to add new types of blocks. So traditionally, FARMAX really has only cared about effective area that can grow grass. And that, as you can probably understand, is because we have a strong kind of feed budgeting focus, but we have added in the ability to add a couple of different block types now. So in this example, if I right click on the top farm level in the FARMAX 8 webinar, I've got the option now to add a regular pasture block like you've always been able to, but you can now also add a forestry block or another block. So in this example, if I add in forestry block, let's rename this to something like pines. We can pop in the area. I'm going to pick Pinus radiata as a species, and let's say that this plantation is 10 years old. I can pop that in there. And essentially this is fairly simple at the moment, but we're certainly looking for feedback on some of the things that you'd like to see incorporated with forestry. We definitely probably had a sheep and beef focus in mind, to be perfectly honest, when we added this in, but there was some demand on the dairy side, so we've added this as an option in the dairy version as well. So that's the first block type. The other block type we have is other, so this might be undeveloped area. In this case, I'm going to add another block. I'm going to make it 10 hectares. And I'm going to call this something like races and sheds, just to give you an example of some ineffective area. And one of the cool things that this does is it gives you the option to filter on a few different definitions of area when you're looking at some of the various reports. So if I take our profit and loss, for example, I have the option to filter on per total hectare, and that is actually going to include the forestry blocks and the undeveloped blocks. So if I filter on everything, we've currently got a farm profit before tax of $2,786. If I were to drop that down to just the farm area, so farm area in FARMAX is defined as basically just blocks and pasture. So in this case, it's our 100 hectare block 1 over on the left here. If I was to change that to per farm hectare, I'd scroll down and we're seeing our farm profit before tax on a per hectare basis slightly higher now because it's dividing by a smaller area. So those are some new options that are available. And if you want to get a feel for what areas are actually set up for your particular farm, you can see that at the top farm properties level. So for this particular farm, we've got a total area of 130 hectares. So that's the combination of all 3 blocks set up. We've got a farm area of 100 hectares. So that's just what's able to be in pasture. And then we've got a grazing area actually of 95.5. So that is telling me that averaged out over the entire 12 months of the season, we have about 4.5 hectares out for crop at any given point in time. So that's just telling us what area on average throughout the season is available in pasture, and those are sort of the 3 different area definitions that we get. So let's keep moving along. The next thing we're going to have a look at some of the new features with our crops and feeds. So we do have a few enhancements here. So I'm going to head down to the crops and feeds database, and we've made a couple of changes here. So right off the bat, you will see one initial input to the different feeds that is new. So traditionally, this is the area where you set up any new crops or any new purchase feeds or blends that you might be purchasing onto the property. Again, it had a strong sort of production and financial focus, and it still does. So you'd be going in and adding in the Emmy value and the price paid and all those sorts of things. A couple of things are new here. So firstly, we've now added an accrued protein setting, and that will drive some of the numbers that you see in your end surplus reports. So if you're buying in 10 tonne of feed, for example, you know, and you have a high accrued protein percentage, then that will increase your end surplus number versus the same amount of feed with a low accrued protein percentage. So that will have an impact. So definitely add that one in when you're setting up your new feeds. And some of the other things we've added have been requests from users to basically allow a bit more flexibility when setting up your supplements. So a really good example of this is we'll have a look at baleage bought, so purchased in feed. Now, one of the areas where people have struggled to get really specific in the past is if they're buying in, for example, baleage from multiple different places, and not all of those bales are the same quality, for example. So what we've allowed users to do now is we've now got this little ellipsis just to the right of energy, and you're actually able to update the Emmy value for that baleage on a monthly basis. So if for example, in January, you're feeding high quality baleage, you might set this to 11 or 12. And if in April or May, you were feeding out some poorer quality baleage that you had on hand, you could drop that Emmy value down to reflect that. So that is one of the new options that has been added in. We also have that option available for utilization. That one has been there for a little while, but Emmy is brand new. And one of the other things we've added, again, to do with bought feed, and I'm going to use the same example here. So if we're buying baleage from a few different places, we've actually added more flexibility with price. So if I click this little ellipsis here just next to dollars per bale in my buy and sell price, we now have the option to set different prices on a monthly basis. So if you're purchasing bales in July for $95, you can set that up. If you're then purchasing more bales from somewhere else at $100 in September, you can set that up. And this one should save you basically setting up lots of different types of baleage to you know, to reflect these settings that you can now enter under one. So palm kernel is probably another good example of that. If you don't contract palm kernel and you're buying it at various different prices throughout the season, you can set that up. So those are some of the things we've added to the crops and feeds database. Next, we're going to go down and have a look at some of the additions to blocks. So we've made a couple of new changes here. And really the changes we've made here are twofold. So we've added in a couple of smaller features around environmental reporting, and we've also added one actually around paddocks. So if I go down to nitrogen, just as an example, and let's say I added a new nitrogen event for April. So click new nitrogen and we'll put this in. Let's say that went on the 1st of April. A couple of new things have been added. So the first thing you might notice is we have this little fertilizer drop-down menu, and we can set whether that fertilizer was urea or something else. And that is going to have an influence on the urea hydrolysis number that you see in your greenhouse gas reporting. So I'm going to say that that was urea. And the second thing we've added that is new is the ability to select individual paddocks that you've put this nitrogen on. So I now have this little ellipsis just next to the 25 hectares area. If I click on that, I'll see all my paddocks. You'll see I have some very unoriginal paddock names, but I can basically click around and say that I applied, say, nitrogen on each of these paddocks. It'll add up the area down the bottom, and if I click OK, that will recalculate that I must have put urea on 70 hectares if I put it, across those 7 paddocks in this case. So that's what's been added there with the nitrogen. Similar setup in the cropping. So if I, for example, say that I cut some pasture silage in October, let's say, something like this, I can do the same thing with area. So I've got the option to click this button and add in that I took silage off paddock 1 and paddock 10, hit OK, and it's calculated that that must have been 20 hectares of silage being cut. Cool. So those are some of the newer features that we've added at the block. I'm just conscious of time here, so we'll keep moving along. Next thing I should mention is our genetic merit updates. So I'm going to go to the properties and cows. We have made a few changes. So firstly, you might notice that this looks a little bit different. Previously, this screen was a few different tabs where you could click the main properties, then the genetic merit, and so on to see the various settings. So I've got that all on one screen now. And the main thing I want to talk about here is the changes we've made to breeding width. So we've now updated our BWs behind the scenes so that you can work off the latest base year and the latest economic values for the dairy farms that you're setting up. And essentially all you need to do is go ahead and click the genetic base year that you want to work off. So if you've got up-to-date breeding values, you can work off the 2016 genetic base, and the economic values are updated annually. So if you know all your numbers there, you'll also want to work off 2020. And then you can go ahead after that and type in either your breeding worth or your individual breeding values if you've actually got the details to that level. One of the things I will say is when you do update those stats, it will influence some of the production behind the scenes that's coming out. So one tip I would suggest is before you do change those numbers, particularly if you're doing it in a FARMAX file for this current year, for example, we obviously don't want our actual kind of nicely calibrated milk production to move around too much if we're changing genetic merit, because we've already calibrated it and that production has happened. So one tip I would suggest is just going into the performance screen, clicking lock milk production. That will keep your lactation curve kind of fixed in place, and then you can go ahead and change your genetic merit numbers and it'll sort of hold that lactation curve. It may recalculate the pasture intake slightly because it thinks that those cows may have required more or less pasture to do that production if we actually have slightly different genetic merit settings for them. But at the very least, that will keep your production identical and save you having to mess around kind of recalibrating that. So that would be the one thing I'd suggest there. But those are some of the changes that we have made to genetic merit. So the final thing I'd like to go through today, and this will be the area where hopefully we're going to save any of you a lot of time with doing your updates to FARMAX, is in the performance screen. So I'm going to go to cows and performance. And there's a few different things that you'll see here. So firstly, just a little kind of visual thing to potentially make this screen a little bit clearer. There are a lot of things going on in this screen. We're well aware of that. So you now have the option at the top right of each of these sort of 3 sections of the performance screen. You have the option to display just the plot or just the graph, just the table or both, or you can hide them. So I'm currently working on my laptop and the screen is a little bit squished up. So let's say I want to get rid of my pasture cover. I can go hide all, and now I'm just down to my feeding and lactation curve, and I've got a little bit more space on the screen to sort of work on things there. So that is one of the handier kind of visual things that we've added. In terms of the main changes to how you actually use this screen day to day, there's a few things that we've updated. So the first one is around feeding. So let's have a look at that. So traditionally, as many of you will know, when you set up your feeding in FARMAX, you were basically restricted to add in things on a kilos of dry matter per head per day offered basis. That was sort of the numbers you had to add in. So you had to say I'm feeding 2 kilos a cow, 3 kilos a cow, whatever the number is. So we've added in some flexibility around that, because we know there were a lot of people that were, if you're in a consulting role, had data from farmers, or if you're a farmer doing it yourself, you might know that, I've fed 20 or 30 or 40 bales of silage as an example. And then you're kind of sitting there, plugging numbers into a calculator, trying to figure out what that per head allocation is. So if you've got that raw data of just the total tons or the total number of bales sitting there, you're now able to type that straight in and have FARMAX sort of do the work with calculating the per head numbers for you. So just to show you an example of that, we have the option feeding out up the top here. So if I click feeding out, and I'm going to add in some feeding to the milkers. So we're already on milkers, so no change there. I'm going to pick April, and I'm going to do this on a 10 daily basis. So if I pick from the 1st of the month to the 10th of the month, I'm now able to add in my baleage numbers. So in this example, for the first 10 days of April, I fed 30 bales of silage. So I can type in 30. You'll see FARMAX calculates out that was 2.08 kilos per head. Flick through the next 10 days. Let's say I fed 20 bales through that period. Next 10 days, I fed 10 bales. And for each of those periods, you should see that it calculates the per head intakes with that amount of baleage going out. I can then hit done, and that's when it will recalculate the expected production from that diet setup for the cows. So that has got some supplementary feeding in. One of there are two other things that we've added to this particular screen. So the first one is milk actuals. Traditionally, when you enter your bulk milk production into FARMAX, that was kind of hidden away up until, so we've moved that into a more convenient spot, and we can now just click this milk actuals button here and put the data straight in. So if I head down to April again for this example and go 10 daily, I will plug in some numbers here just as an example. Just click the arrow through to the next 10 days. And again, arrow through to the next 10 days. And at the moment, I'm just entering bulk milk production to factory, but if you have, for example, milk withheld for penicillin, or you're, where you're currently calving and you're withholding milk from the vat for calf milk, you can also enter the liters for that in here as well. But I'm just going to add the milk to factory for now, because that's all of the milk on the farm. We're not withholding any, so click done. And you'll see I've now got this little dotted line for my actual milk production in April. So next thing we're going to do is show you auto calibration. So just to talk you through what the traditional way of calibrating milk production was, if you weren't already familiar. Essentially, the problem we've got at the moment is that currently I've got modeled milk production of 0.86 kilos milk solids per head. Our actual production was only 0.63. So we're a fair way out from having those two aligned. And usually the way that we line those two up is we basically go in to this pasture offered figure, and we move that up or down until modeled production lands in the right place. Now, that can get very fiddly. So basically what we've done is we've automated that calculation. So you'll now see that you've got a little button here called Calibrate Milk, just above your lactation curve. If I click Calibrate Milk in this example, and I'm clicked in April, we've got a cool little screen that's going to calibrate this for us. So for most circumstances, I would say all you're going to do is come into the screen and basically hit go or hit auto. One of the things you can do if you want is you can also override the pasture Emmy or the utilization that you want to that you've budgeted on for that particular period of time. So if you thought that pasture quality was higher than 10.9, and obviously got quite a high utilization in there at the moment, so if you wanted to pull that down to something that you thought was reasonable, you can edit those two inputs first. But assuming you're happy with those two, which I'm just going to leave them as they are for now, I can hit auto, and you should see that FARMAX will start to calculate on a 10 daily basis what the actual sort of pasture offered must have been for the cows to do that production with that level of supplementary feed, and with those cow numbers and all the other factors that we've kind of got behind the scenes. So that has done its thing there. You'll see we've got a nicely calibrated production curve there. So I'm going to exit out. And you'll see in April, we've now got 0.63 and 0.63. So it's calibrated it for us. That will hopefully save you a lot of time when you're doing your milk calibrations in practice. And if I split out April, you'll see the three different sort of pasture offered numbers that it has calculated for us. So that is all of the features that we've added into FARMAX 8 as a bit of a demonstration for you. If you do have any last questions, definitely fire them through, but I hope that was helpful for understanding some of the new features of FARMAX 8, and I hope that some of the new things in there are going to be quite valuable for each of your respective businesses moving forward. So as I mentioned earlier, there will be a replay of the webinar sent out to you over the next day or so if you're wanting to watch the replay at all. But if there's no further questions, I thank you all for joining us and hope you have a great day.